danger that cyberspace could be stifled by government intervention. In fact, whenever government overextends its eminent domain capabilities, we actually see unintended and generally negative consequences. The other problem with putting too much trust in government activity is cyberspace operates at cyber time. And even those governments that are very aware of the problems that are facing us are still operating on political time. At the end of the day, it is really private enterprise who is better equipped to respond and address the issues that we're facing in cyberspace. A successful private enterprise basically creates more value than it consumes. So by incurring the obligation as the largest user of cyberspace, I think private enterprise has an obligation to improve this commons that we share and to create innovation in it. Private enterprise also has a vested interest in cyberspace. One way to think of cybercrime is in what the philosophers call the tragedy of the commons. Unrestrained use by individuals or groups ruins the commons for everyone else. The interesting thing about this particular commons is the network effects. The more it's used, the more value it becomes. One of the major issues of cybercrime is that it destroys users' trust in cyberspace. And Francis Fukuyama, who is a famous philosopher and economist, has said, trust is the foundation for all economic activity. So when people become afraid of using cyberspace, when they lose the trust in their transactions, their information, and their data, then the value for that person in cyberspace is lost. But perhaps more importantly, the value to all of us is significantly diminished. I think the end lesson of all of this is have government as a trustee and implement whatever is necessary to get the economic issues correct, and private enterprise will be able to come to the rescue, so to speak. Thank you, Armin.
Well, thank you, Jim. I think you raised an important point, which is about trust. And you represent one of the biggest multinational corporations here. Your product is I don't know how to call it. It's infrastructure, critical or non-critical, doesn't matter. But at the end of the day, we use the internet by using your hardware and also software. But the world has changed during the last decade, and now it's really interactive, interconnected, interdependent, it's global. And when you are speaking about building a trust, at the end of the day, when you build even a simple computer, a part of that computer, the know-how or the research and development probably is done somewhere, let's say in the West, here in Texas, or maybe in France or elsewhere. Then a part of the software is written in California. Sometimes it's written in California by Russian or Ukrainian guys that moved here, or they outsource that part to Russia. And a lot of your computers or components of the computers these days are made in China. So it's a real international effort. And how do you build the trust? How do you create the trust that at the end of the day, one of these production elements will not be honest or will violate the trust and put something inside in your hardware, the software will eventually be used by a state or by a non-state activity?
Wow. How many days do we have to answer that one? The whole, and it's referred to as the ODM issue, the security and trust in the supply chain is a major issue. And it's not just in necessarily your trading partners, but the ability of the componentry to be intercepted, to be replaced, to be modified in transit. So one of the things that all large companies with large supply chains are engaging in is communications among themselves. And in fact, the US government has begun working on how do we establish standards and mechanisms not only for the actual contracting and maintaining of the supply chain, but the actual tracking and maintenance of all of the individual components that go into it. Unfortunately, where we are today is at what point do you stop tracking those components? Because I may have a disk drive, for example, that's been assembled in Malaysia that has a spinning media component and then also has basically electronic control component. Well, each of those components are further made of other components that have associated chips into them, the actual the wiring that's associated with them. And even those are made from designs and components that come from somewhere else. In fact, there was an interesting movie, I think it was called Westworld in the late 70s, when people were starting to worry about computers, in which people could go live their fantasy out in a land where robots basically were knights and madams and cowboys and whatever. And the discussion in the movie was that the robots were built by computers that 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 were built by computers, and nobody knew anymore what was inside of them. So it's an issue for the industry. You're starting to see some customers require destructive testing of the equipment that they buy, but it's probably even in many ways more of a major issue than just the traditional hacking that we've seen in the internet as it exists now.
And probably, as you said, the solution could be either building a trust. You create partners that you can trust by monitoring and tracking the system as far as you can, which is another part, and then probably a combination of all of this together. And of course, it will change the whole process of how you procure a component, because it's not only about the quality, the name, or the price. It goes also about, there'll be probably tomorrow another paragraph that you have to tick. Trust. Do you trust?
And if you think about it, all economics is based upon trust. You get on an airplane, you're trusting that pilot, you're trusting the maintenance crew, you're trusting the company that has hired the pilot and the maintenance crew, you're trusting the air traffic controllers. You buy an apple in a grocery store.
You trust the nature that will not come with another volcano.
Absolutely. So, you know, at the end of the day, it really becomes, how does one establish, maintain, and preserve the trust?
Oh, thank you very much, Jim. Matt, it's the same question, but you are coming with your background working for big multinationals, European or Euro-Atlantic. Now you work with a rising star, which is called Huawei. Nobody will believe in 10, 15 years ago that, I do remember in places like former Soviet Union republics, even Russia, Huawei equipment was considered as a sort of a second class. There were always questions. They are copying here and there, and not as a good equipment. In 10, 15 years now, if we look, Huawei is one of the biggest in the world, and one which is equal to Ericsson's, Nokia's, Alcatel-Lucent's, and others. So I think your perspective it's very interesting. Your experience is interesting, Matt.
Well, thank you very much, Armin. And if I just made a statement, and it's perhaps a statement of the obvious, but people do business with people they trust. And it doesn't matter if it's from the very first line of credit that a small startup company obtains, all the way through the supply chains of large multinational businesses. People do business with people they trust. And there's a Russian proverb that I'm reminded of that says, trust, but check. And in the spirit of trust but check is embodied a whole series of concepts that say we have to be able to measure, as I would say one of the biggest barriers, and contrasting my friend James here, when you are coming from the outside in to, let's just say, this market, having spent the last 7 years serving British Telecom as a chief technology officer, so looking at things from the outside in, there is not a dialogue or a framework that is well understood on a global basis to where you can engage in a dialogue that can become the platform for trust and discussion. I would say out of that platform, then you move to how do you measure the trust that is needed to stimulate and continue